After my last two videos, I thought I didn't need to cover anything else related with the causes of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. But I was wrong. I mentioned that everything started in 2014 with the coup promoted by the United States in Ukraine. I also mentioned that people in eastern Ukraine did not accept this coup, which triggered a conflict between the east and the west of Ukraine. The result of all this, more than 14,000 people were killed since 2014, thanks to the puppet regime installed by the United States in the Ukraine. But most people don't know this, nor what happened between 2014 and 2022, before Russia started its special military operation in Ukraine, because the Western media omits or simply lies about what happened in the last 8 years in order to claim that there was no reason for Russia to do what it did on February 24th of 2022. When Vladimir Putin made his speech detailing the reasons for the special military operation, highlighting the need to demilitarize and to denazify Ukraine, the Western media started spreading propaganda that what Putin said was a lie and that Ukraine did not need to be demilitarized, nor did it need to be denazified, and that Russia just decided to attack Ukraine for no reason. But as I'm going to show you in this video, the Western media lied to you once again, so let's begin. In 2014, after the Maidan coup, and with a newly installed and not elected government in Ukraine, this puppet regime of the United States started implementing their plan. Their goal was to build an army that could face Russia, a huge army that would be trained and supplied by the United States and NATO members in anticipation of the proxy war that was going to happen in the future. The United States knew very well the conflict was going to happen eventually because they were making sure to provoke Russia with more and more military bases near Russian borders and also military exercises very close to those borders. Furthermore, Russia had already warned that the United States or NATO interfering with Ukraine would be the brightest of red lines, which is exactly why the United States did what it did. They wanted to provoke Russia, as I've showed you in past videos. And with this huge army being built and financed by the United States and NATO, that before the conflict started in February 2022 was over 500,000 troops in size, Ukraine was definitely Russia's biggest threat at that point in time. Another goal of the newly installed government in Ukraine was to rewrite Ukraine's history. In 2015, the puppet president of Ukraine, Poroshenko, signed a package of laws rushed through the parliament of Ukraine that aimed to do just that. Ukraine's history would now be revised, and the fact that Ukraine had been part of the Soviet Union needed to be ignored and forgotten. Whoever dared to view Ukraine's past in the Soviet Union as something good would end up in prison for 10 years. This is the type of laws you see in totalitarian regimes, not democracies. Apparently, these laws condemn both communist and Nazi totalitarian regimes. However, the enforcement of the laws only focuses on the communist side. Another law actually proves exactly that, because it's a law that praises the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, that collaborated with the Nazis during the Second World War and was responsible for killing Jews and communists and numerous atrocities against other ethnic minorities. Roman Shukevich was the UPA's commander and also a notorious anti-Semite. Do you know who wrote the law that praised the UPA? The son of Roman Shukevich, Yuri Shukevich. In other words, Ukraine under the United States control was set to demonize Russia, the Soviet Union, and Ukraine's past as part of it, but also to glorify Nazis and Nazism. When talking about the Nazi influence and the glorification of Nazism in Ukraine, it's impossible not to talk about Stepan Bandera. Much like the members of the UPA, Stepan Bandera was a Nazi collaborator that committed atrocities against Jews and Poles during the Second World War. He was part of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN, and second in command of that group in 1933. In fact, Bandera's name has been infused into Ukrainian politics for a long time now. In 2010, Bandera was named a Hero of Ukraine by the outgoing president Viktor Yushchenko. In 2011, Viktor Yanukovych stripped Bandera from his Hero of Ukraine title, But with the coup in 2014 and with Yanukovych removed from power, Bandera's name was back, and Kiev's Moscow Avenue was replaced with Stepan Bandera Avenue. Across western Ukraine, Stepan Bandera is indeed a national hero, with several monuments to him, and Lviv city seems to be the center of it all. Lviv is dominated by fascist political parties like Svoboda and others. In 2019, Lviv declared it the year of Stepan Bandera, and it was pressuring Volodymyr Zelensky, that had recently been elected as president of Ukraine, to rename Lviv Arena in honor of Stepan Bandera. And recently we had a very embarrassing situation for Ukraine and its supporters when the ambassador for Ukraine in Germany, Andrei Melnik, defended Stepan Bandera and denied Bandera did any atrocities. The Western media was quick to dismiss it, or didn't even talk about the matter, because since the start of the current conflict that the Western media tries to hide the truth about the Nazi influence in Ukraine. But it cannot escape it. Reuters, for example, wrote an article claiming that a local resident inspects a damaged van following a military strike, which had a photo attached, and it indeed showed a man inspecting a damaged van. But this man had a very large tattoo on his arm, and that tattoo was a swastika, a very well-known Nazi symbol. The Nazi influence in Ukraine goes very deep and is supported at the state level. When the Maidan coup happened in 2014, for example, several fascist organizations in Ukraine became more influent than ever, like the Right Sector. All of this Nazi support in Ukraine has always sparked protests from governments in Poland and Israel, for example, as they were some of the victims of Bandera's and the UPA's atrocities. However, when Russia said it was going to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine with its special military operation, all these countries seem to have forgotten about the history of Ukraine and its Nazi influence, as well as the atrocities committed by the Ukrainians against them. The European Union and the United States specifically all coordinated to say the same thing. Claiming Ukraine was under Nazi influence was nothing more than Russian propaganda. The reality, of course, is quite different, and this is why the laws that Ukraine passed were very dangerous, because they want to rewrite history and persecute those who dare to talk about the actual history. This Nazi influence goes beyond the Azov battalion, goes beyond any fascist political party, and there are many in Ukraine, because that Nazi influence is part of Ukraine's culture, specifically Western Ukraine, exactly the same Western Ukraine that the United States financed to build a huge army to fight against Russia. History repeats itself, once again Nazis against Russians. Ever since the Second World War, it was agreed that Nazis are to be condemned and not to be supported in any way. But the United States and NATO did the opposite. They funded the Nazis and made them strong again. For the Russians that lost more than 20 million people in their fight against Nazis in the Second World War, this was not acceptable, and they needed to do something about it. For the people of eastern Ukraine, that are mostly ethnic Russians, this was also totally unacceptable, which is why they declared independence from Ukraine after they held a vote. They would no longer be a part of the corrupt and fascist country that Ukraine was since the coup in 2014. The puppet Ukrainian government took notice and created further laws to directly target the ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine, namely by banning the use of the Russian language. Russian was a language spoken by many Ukrainians, if nothing else due to Ukraine's history as part of the Soviet Union. Banning its use was meant to create further instability in eastern Ukraine and to justify the presence of the Ukrainian army in those regions. The Ukrainian army had already started bombing cities in Donetsk and Lugansk, killing many people, but their reign of terror went much further than that. They terrorized, tortured, and killed with brutality many people in eastern Ukraine just because they spoke Russian or showed the slightest nostalgia for Soviet Union times. I'm blurring these images because of their shocking nature, but you should see them yourselves to get a glimpse of the horrors that the Ukrainian government and army did to the people in eastern Ukraine. All of this financed by the United States, NATO members, and the silence of the European Union. These barbaric crimes committed by the Ukrainian regime against the people of eastern Ukraine are disgusting, and anyone siding with the Ukrainian regime is no better than they are. We are talking about psychopathic animals that like to torture and kill people who disagree with them, that dare to speak Russian, that dare to view Ukraine's history as something else than bad. How anyone can side with these animals is beyond me, but that's exactly what the United States, NATO members, and the European Union did. In fact, it was even worse than that. All of these crimes were blatantly ignored by organizations like the European Court of Human Rights. Thousands of complaints against the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian government were all ignored because there was a clear agenda against Russians and Russian speakers in the West. In total, more than 10,000 civilians died between 2014 and 2022 in the Donbass conflict, and the European Union and its values did nothing to stop it. In fact, it sided with the ones committing the genocide. And if the Russians did not start their special military operation, that's exactly what would continue to happen. Since 2014 that the United States finances the building and training of the Ukrainian army, an army trained to persecute, torture and kill ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine that dare not to accept the new regime. Do you remember who did something similar a few decades ago? The Nazis. During the current conflict, the Ukrainian army continued to show a complete disregard for the lives of the people of eastern Ukraine, precisely because they do not view them as people. Which is why the Ukrainian army constantly uses civilian buildings like hospitals, shopping malls, residential buildings, nursing homes, etc. to place military equipment and/or soldiers. And when the Russians attack those military targets, the Ukrainians claim the Russians killed civilians, and it's a war crime. Even the propaganda from Western media that sides with Ukraine no matter what had to highlight this behavior because the Ukrainians do it so much. And when the Ukrainians can't use the civilian buildings and the civilians themselves as shields, then they just bomb civilian targets without hesitation, which is what's been happening in Donbass for 8 years. This is a barbaric tactic and a war crime, but the institutions that should care about these things are the same that ignore the thousands of complaints against the Ukrainian army and government due to the atrocities they committed against the people of eastern Ukraine. In effect, those institutions are worthless, corrupt, and exist only to make people think that human rights are being enforced and war crimes are being prevented. But that is another lie. These institutions don't care about the war crimes or human rights violations done by those that pay them large sums of money, like the United States, for example, the biggest war criminal in the world. And given that Ukraine is a puppet of the United States, Ukraine is also protected and can commit as many war crimes and human rights violations as it wants, without even a single condemnation. As the current conflict continues, we now have images of the heavily fortified locations that the Ukrainian army built in the Donbass region for 8 years, and that the Russian army had to attack and destroy. These are not fortified areas built to fight against the militias of the DPR and LPR with limited resources and fighting forces. These fortified areas were built to fight a war against a powerful army, the Russian army, and they were preparing for it for 8 years with the financial and military support of the United States and NATO members. And I did not forget the Minsk Accords, but they were not that relevant. The Minsk Accords sought to end the conflict, or at least to reach a ceasefire in the Donbass, but were a failure because there were repeated ceasefire violations from both sides, although several of the ceasefire violations were blamed on third parties. The European countries involved in those accords, namely France and Germany, only wanted to have the press release after the signing and look good on the photos, but didn't really care about making sure that the accords were not violated by Ukraine. And because Western media is nothing more than propaganda and lies, none of this information is known by the vast majority of people. In fact, the Western media propaganda has elevated a single man to hero status just because he was the Ukrainian president at the time, Volodymyr Zelensky. However, Zelensky is in no way a hero, quite far from it, because ever since he became president, that he continued the exact same path that his predecessors took since 2014. The same path of aggression against the people of eastern Ukraine, the same path of rewriting history, the same path of glorifying Nazis, the same path of persecuting ethnic Russians in Ukraine. Zelensky is a puppet like all before him since 2014, and he does nothing without the approval of the United States government. In fact, he won his election in 2019 with the support of the United States. Nina Yankowicz was part of his campaign, for example, the same Nina Yankowicz that was an advisor to the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry between 2016 and 2017, the same Nina Yankowicz that was going to be the head of the Disinformation Board in the United States. Coincidence? No, it wasn't a coincidence. The United States is involved in Ukraine's affairs like no other country in the world, and they are now responsible for its destruction too. Zelensky is also the hero that, while he forces thousands of Ukrainian men to die on the battlefield, is doing photo shoots for Vogue magazine with his wife. This is what the United States, NATO members and the European Union have created. A media star, a puppet that serves the interests of the West at the expense of the lives of others. Zelensky is also selling Ukraine's land and resources to United States companies. The United States is doing what it always does: destroy entire countries, pillages and steals all of the resources, and when there's nothing left, they leave to find another victim. The United States doesn't care about Ukraine or Ukrainians. As I said in my very first video about the causes of this conflict, the United States will use Ukraine as nothing more than a pawn in their war against Russia. And the European Union does exactly the same. Ukraine is just a shield for the European Union's Russophobia. The Eurocrats hate Russia and Russians in general with a passion, very much like Nazis hated Jews or anyone that dared to oppose their ideology. Which is why we see statements like these from the EU. Ukrainians are ready to die for the European perspective. This is the definition of elitism and proof that these people are completely out of touch with reality. An organization claiming other people are ready to die for the so-called European perspective. I'm sure many Ukrainian men being forced by the Zelensky regime to fight in this proxy war disagree with the European Union completely. They do not want to die for the European perspective or any perspective of the elites that provoked and created this conflict at the expense of Ukrainian and Russian lives. The constant supply of weapons to Ukraine by the United States, European Union and NATO members also shows that they do not want this conflict to end. They want it to last as much as possible, just to try to hurt Russia. A conflict that has lasted for 8 years, multiple atrocities committed, all of them from the Ukrainian side, backed by the United States, NATO members and the European Union, that dismissed all complaints against the Ukrainian government and army and essentially covered up the genocide that was happening in eastern Ukraine. And when Russia started its special military operation in Ukraine, all of these countries pledged full support to the aggressors and genocidal maniacs of the Ukrainian regime because they needed to support their own creation. For me, it's shocking how many people just want to erase parts of known history to justify their support of this or that cause. It shows that many people have no integrity, no values, no principles, and are ideologically motivated no matter what reality really is. The sad conclusion out of all this is that conflicts like these will continue to happen because most people don't really care about the facts. Most people don't really care about history, and most people will continue to support genocides and atrocities of all sorts because they trust what corrupt and criminal politicians tell them on TV. I hope you like this, and I'll see you next time.